that are engaging in this. To address these questions, we invite Mr. Shaunak Sarkar from Side Proposition.
All right. So much cooler from this side for the first time. A lot has been spoken about by the previous speaker on a very emotional note about all the good things the media has done. None of us are discounting any of that. We're not saying at any point of time from our side that the media never indulges in lots of selfless efforts at making sure that institutions are scrutinized in front of the public. We never claim that the media in an absolute sense is completely messed up. All we're trying to tell you is there are certain things that the media as a collective industry can do that it has failed to do in terms of setting certain standards of ethics uniformly for all media industries, in terms of making sure that certain kinds of ethical guidelines from the editorial side downwards are strictly enforced within that media house. All of these things need to be followed up. You can't point out individual stories of bravery and give them an award and say, well, the media is doing its job. We commend all of that, but we tell you that the media can do more than that. And unless and until it doesn't do that, we still think that they are in breach of our trust. I'll quickly respond to a few things Mr. Vinod Sharma spoke about, right? He came up and he broadly said two things. He said, first of all, the end consumer is the one that determines how the media functions. And the second thing he said is, we have to understand what the media can do within its limited sphere of influence, that it works under the market forces, right? I'm going to deal with these things first before I explain in more detail why it's so important that you need to understand the nature and the psychology of the consumer who's reading this news item in order to establish how important this trust is at an absolute level. After which I will speak to you about examples of how sensationalism has not only failed to inform the citizen, but in fact has misled collective discourses on certain very important social issues in our country, right? Firstly, the idea that the newspaper is not responsible, but the consumer is. Firstly, we need to understand what the consumer in itself is. So I'll begin with that idea, right? Because the problem with identifying the consumer as the person who regulates what the media gives is a false causation. We tell you, first of all, that there is an inelastic demand for the kind of news that the media gives out. The consumer is the recipient of it. It is indeterminate what kind of news the newspaper gives to its consumers in order to decide whether the consumer demands it. The consumer can only receive news from the media and nothing else. And the media has a unique capacity in this sense to disseminate certain kinds of information in certain ways. We tell you that there's a historical responsibility that the media has claimed upon itself, which has brought the media to a position of power and authority with the only purveyors of information in a democracy. We tell you that this historical claim or ownership of responsibility as the givers of true and balanced information puts itself in a position of trust vis-a-vis the citizens. Not only that, we tell you that even in terms of organizational justice, we tell you that the organic democracy that we have today is shaped around the trust we place in the media to be the watchdog of certain institutions, including the state and other private corporations. The media has a monopoly over two things over here. The media has a monopoly over the content of the information, and it also has a monopoly over the medium through which it disseminates this information. And we tell you that currently there's a cartelization of both of these things. In terms of a horizontal cartelization with regard to certain companies owning different media like the radio channel and the print media and the electronic TV media. At the same time, there's a form of vertical cartelization where it owns not only the content of the news, but also means to distribute it. And we tell you that this is extremely dangerous in order to make, against the idea of plurality of information that the consumers must receive, right? Now, how does that happen? I've already told you that the consumer is in no position to change what it needs to expect from the newspaper, right? Now, the media works in certain ways of bias. It works through advertisement bias. It works through a corporate bias. It works through a sensationalism bias. And it works through a mainstream bias. All of these biases are usually a trade-off between profiteering and true information. And we tell you these trade-offs aren't necessary. But before that, let's understand why this trust is so important. It's because when you look at the citizens who are receiving this information, there are three ways to describe these citizens. They're gullible, they're credulous, and they're unquestioning. And that's where the problem begins with the media not being responsible or being overly scrutinizing what it gives out. Because, first of all, the way the news reaches these people, most of the citizens are not in a position to question or analyze or critically examine this information unless and until they have access to equal amounts of countervailing circumstances, which most of the population in this country doesn't have. We tell you it's not only the news that reaches the individuals, it's news that reaches a class of individuals, which means you need to raise questions of like uniformity of certain narratives that are being enforced and reinforced by the media across a certain class of people. If, for instance, it's not like one woman in the household who sees a TV report claiming that women are being immoral in colleges like in Hyderabad for that matter. It's not a single woman it's not a single Dalit who's looking at caste issues being touched upon by the newspaper. It's the entire community that's looking at the same kind of reporting of each and every newspaper. And therefore, my question to them is, if an individual cannot mobilize his views against a collective cooperative network of reinforcing certain discourses in our country, then how do you expect individuals to mobilize within each other? We tell you this mobility is completely chilled by the way the media disseminates this information, and that's extremely important in making sure that you place a higher threshold of obligation on this media to make sure that the information is not only comprehensive, but it's also analytical to the extent which portrays the information in a holistic manner. More importantly, there are certain concepts that also play into this factor. Most of the news that transferred in a 24/7 media are usually snappy. They have this concept of breaking news where every 2 seconds a new event happens. Most often they're sensational events like an air crash or something like that. We tell you that, first of all, this rapidity of information kind of connects to the people in a way where people have short attention spans. There's a conservative bias that plays within these people's minds, because what people do when they're given information with a mixture of subjective estimates and objective observations is they try to reaffirm their views that they already hold about certain issues, and the media doesn't do anything to further those debates. They only reaffirm those views in terms of conservative ideals of gender disparity, conservative notions about the attitudes against the judiciary, conservative attitudes about the failure of the government. And we tell you the media is not really doing us a favor by giving us these bits and pieces of information without giving us true information. If you look at the analysis, in fact, Noopur came up with, she said that we did a lot in terms of Jessica Lal, we did a lot in terms of making sure that judiciary works well. Well, first of all, we don't think trial by media is a good idea, but more importantly, we tell you that when these issues were covered, the biggest problem the media had to tackle with at that point of time was explaining to the common man ideas of due process of law, ideas of evidentiary standards. The newspaper kept blaming the courts for not convicting the party who was suspected to be the criminal. But they did not talk about the police reforms that are the primary reason why evidence doesn't reach these courts. We tell you that such superficial and poorly researched analysis by the newspapers isn't going to further debates on issues of national importance, and that's what we need to watch out for. That's the kind of obligation these media houses need to fulfill, right? The problem with this environment within which the Indian media is functioning is that there's so much legal immunity against them. The Supreme Court went on and propounded the idea of self-regulation. In fact, the only innovation we've had from the court in the SEBI case was one of postponement, and that once again was controversial in terms of the intrusion on media independence. We tell you that there was a print and electronic media standards bill introduced in 2012 that was discarded because most critics felt that it invaded the independence of the media. This places the media in a more important position of trust because they are the only people who can make sure that they convey the right information to people. And how has it been doing this so far? Let's look at the Z News case. Let's look at the Neera Radia case. These two examples merit some mention in this debate. In the Z News case, when the Colgate scam happened, something the media claims to have introspected so well, we tell you that most media organizations completely blacked out information simply because they were paid by different companies to not disclose information on their association with this scam. The problem right now that we might have to face is we just don't know what we don't know. And that's a bigger problem with regard to paid news, right? And more importantly, even if you look at the Neera Radia case, the problem with the media lobby is its position of monopoly. It's so networked and it's so cartelized within the media that any piece of information that comes out from the media either percolates across different media channels due to vested interests. For instance, company A might carry the paid news of company B. I think Mr. Guha would be in a better position to analyze that. I stole it from him. But the problem with this is it enforces the view that everything that comes from the media is the only information you can get. And the problem is, in this country, if you do not have substitutes or the uniqueness of what people hold the media to give them, the perception that every information you get from the media is true and balanced and in fact checked with regard to their citation, we tell you that the people aren't in a position to get any alternative source of view, and that's problematic. I'd like to touch upon a last theme in this debate before we move on to hearing what the responses are from the other side. The issue of privacy and the issue of narrating certain discourses, right? If you look at the case of Mangalore, there were sting operations by certain media companies that went into these rave parties in Bangalore that looked at women dressing up in a certain way, and they started passing moral judgments on whether these things are acceptable within the traditional view of our society. We tell you that obviously there's nothing called an objective neutral information. We concede that. But the problem with a discourse such as this is A, it's socially harmful. It's socially harmful because you're reinforcing a collective network view of a certain issue that concerns morality in our country, and it completely immobilizes other stakeholders within this discourse to come up against it, because media does provide most of the channels for this kind of discourse. But the second thing is in certain cases of investigating into crimes such as the Arushi Talwar case, the media imposes a presumption of suspicion or a presumption of guilt upon people who are simply suspected in these cases, and that's even more dangerous because the media doesn't give them a chance. And okay, just one last thing, right? You take reply, I don't know. So I think well, I thought we were all allowed to bunk time. What we need to tell you, at least in some mention, is what we expect the media to do within its limitations. We tell you that at least disclose the source of information and whether there are any vested interests that harm the objectivity of information. Give us, I don't think that just because corporations buy you, you can't hold them back to ransom. Because if corporations do require advertisements, they'll continue to come back to the newspapers. We don't think that there's an alternative for these corporations to function independently. And at the end of the day, we think the media industry is collectively at fault because unless there's a lowest common denominator standards by one group, we don't think any other group is going to subscribe to those standards. For these reasons, I'd like to oppose. Thank you.
Responding to the issues that were raised, and also in particular to bring it back to the entire thing, that if the consumer cannot possibly be responsible given the fact that the consumer is gullible, credulous, and unquestioning, and cannot question without all the information being made available. The responsibility he puts squarely back on the media in terms of the need for self-regulation. If not, when we are protecting the independence and freedom of the media, then it's important in terms of the responsibility that it has in that context. We now have a third speaker from the opposition, Mr. Vipul Nanda, the 5th year student of National Law School.
In a nation where a news anchor can sit across the table from the son of the president of our country and yell at him again and again, humiliate him in front of millions, make him a complete laughingstock for something that, regardless of how you feel about that specific news anchor, was something that he said which was stupid and possibly something that he deserved to undergo. We cannot overstate the importance of the media or the power that it wields. And often enough, and most often enough, it has been a force for the good. What we've seen from side government is this persistent hegemonic idea that the entire media is this one big monolithic thing that keeps doing all these evil things to us and therefore keeps breaching our trust. Because when they say that you can't use individual examples of good things that the media has done, if you look across their speeches, they've given you multiple individual examples of why the media has failed or breached the trust of the Indian citizen without necessarily going into absolute systemic reasons why that is so. Sure, advertising is a problem, but that ignores the fact that the media is not just the mainstream media. And that is what this debate has to consider very, very deeply. And now, let's understand first, who is the media for? I mean, we recognize that in many ways, and that's been said by speakers before, that the media might be for the advertisers, it might be for the citizens, it's for the consumers, it's whether you look at it as a product or whether you look at it as a service in terms of being the fourth estate, okay, the pillar on which Indian democracy stands. But before you get into any of that, you need to know where the media comes from and what it's based on, how it's structured, and why we continue to assume that the media and our perception of the media, of what we see in terms of big newspapers and big TV channels, is not all of it. In fact, the critique of the media that we've seen from side government is as shallow as the media which they're saying is very shallow. Because it keeps saying it's about these specific news houses and the problems that they've had, but they don't look into the really good news houses that exist, that persistently and repeatedly give out great political commentary. When you look at Tehelka, when you look at The Caravan, when you look at several other periodicals that have taken up the mantle of showing good political critique, well-researched investigative journalism, why must we ignore that? Why can we not have all of this at an even plane and consider them equally? Like as Professor Argopal said earlier, to understand anything as an academic, he feels that the context is important, that we must approach it scientifically. For that, we need to know why suddenly, today, we feel that the mainstream media is no longer as good as it used to be. What changed? Some people have suggested it was liberalization, but I don't think that's the complete answer. More than that is the idea of the rise of the Indian middle class. What's happened between 1992 and today is the basic fact that in this interim period, what you've had is a sudden explosion of a vast number of people from the Indian middle class. In 1992, only 13.2% of Indian households had a television. Today, that percentage is at 47.5. That represents 480 new million people who have access to a television. That means that across the last 4 years, the newspaper industry has grown substantially. And this is, of course, the sun rising in the east as opposed to like setting in the west and all of that. But the point still remains that more people have access to media today than they've ever had before in this country. More people have access to that information, and these people are making their voices heard. This is what they want to see. We must face the hard truth. Every critique that you've probably read of the media, either read of the media or heard in this debate, comes from one very particular perspective, that of an elite belief in a system, elite belief in what stands as good media and what doesn't, without looking into how can media be the one to determine what is good or bad, given its role, given its ethics, given the demand of it not to make that kind of value judgment and give what the people the kind of information that they want. Because when it says that this information must be in the public's interest, that begs the question of what the public's interest is. And should we, standing from this rarefied ivory tower, construct what public interest is? Or should we let people decide what they want to watch and read? Because honestly, when we stand here and we talk about the fact that the media is very shallow, that they keep talking about, I don't know, Poonam Pandey or MS Dhoni, hairstyles and paparazzi, and page 3, Shaunak says the news media doesn't know what people want, so they can continue printing this. Now that's the kind of logic that existed pre-Darwin. Obviously, when they give out this kind of article, more people tend to like it, therefore they print it more often, and therefore they have an evolution of that industry, which is what we've seen over the last decade. Because repeatedly, that kind of reportage, that kind of news has been the one that's garnered eyeballs. Let's be honest about it. Let's stop hiding behind this facade of blaming the media for what is our flaw and our faults within our society, in which as we become broader, the kind of tastes and the beliefs that people have inherently changed. And we are allowing the media to cater to that. And simultaneously, we can't claim that the media has breached our trust, because the function of the media is to inform you. Of course, you can say that the mainstream media has changed its role because it's catering to another outlet, but the media as a whole has not. Now, I know for a fact that Shaunak was preparing last night in his room using Google and the internet to find all these articles critiquing the media, right? Now, where did they come from? The point is somewhere deep down, everywhere, the information is out there for you to seek. We can be lazy and we can sit in our rooms and expect all the information that we need to come in a newspaper. But consider two different things. A, how is the media outlet, whether it's a newspaper or whether it's a TV channel, to determine what is all the information you need from one news cycle? We live in a gigantic country with a ridiculously large number of people across various urban settings and rural settings. To have any sort of compilation of all the news that exists in that area is literally impossible. Now, how are you to determine what matters to people or not? You obviously cater to what the maximum number of people want, because that will be the one that sells the most newspapers and gives out that kind of information. If, like Shaunak, you want to be one of those people who can criticize the media from that elitist perspective, go ahead and open kafila.com. There you'll get the critique, the kind of labor union kind of perspective also that you want, or the left-leaning perspective that you want, or go read the Economic and Political Weekly. There are so many media houses in this country that cater to every conceivable demand that you might have of it. From whether cows are being abducted out of rural parts of India on India TV, or whether you want to see a middle-aged Bengali man scream at politicians in this country, you will get it. But you just have to get up and search for it. We can't continue being lazy about it and expecting this to be spoon-fed to us. Because the media's job is to inform. It's your job to come up with an opinion, and it's your job to mobilize, right? Now, the media can give us this information, but we have to be there and we have to take it. We can't be passive receptors for this information and expect it to be downloaded into our brains, right? The apathy with which we criticize this media without having any action of our own to do anything about it is the problem. When earlier the speakers on my side have told you that it's a society and we get the media that we deserve, that's exactly what is happening. And as long as there are enough people in this society who want the kind of media that the government thinks that they deserve, then the government can take recourse to that. Look at the recent aggressive advertising campaign, of the Hindu, when they talked about the comparison between the Hindu and another leading national daily in terms of trying to give a certain kind of reader a better class of newspaper. And I agree with that. I convinced my father after that ad campaign to switch to the Hindu from that said leading national daily. And the reason for that is simple. Because it works. We've seen a situation where we feel an intellectual bankruptcy in our media, which doesn't mean we get to continuously whine and still do our sudokus and crosswords and ignore the actual headlines. Get a better newspaper. Go online, find better information. If you don't, and the vernacular press is incredibly active in many ways. It's not half as bad as some of the English news daily in terms of the kind of allegations of bias, etc. that exist. We must recognize that there are courses that you can take. There are always alternatives. When Shaunak speaks of the monopoly of information and the cartelization, in this era, when anyone can open up a website, in an era where the Neera Radia tapes, which are incredibly embarrassing for mainstream media outlets, found its way online. When you had the Varun Gandhi, recently there was a sting operation done by Tehelka on Varun Gandhi that exposed completely that he had committed hate speech in Pilbit, and that he made 88 different witnesses, the largest number ever considered of, turn hostile over a short period of time. That was something that the Tehelka reported on. Of course, the mainstream media did mention a few articles about it, but then it disappeared. But is that Tehelka's fault? Is that journalism's fault? They went through all that effort, collected all that evidence to present to you, to present to us as a society, and we chose to let it go ignored. Ask yourself, what do you want? When that same news anchor comes up to you and says, the nation demands to know, what does the nation demand to know? That's the question. We aren't asking the right questions. We're letting him decide what the right questions are. And regardless of whether he made that, the guy who said the dented and painted thing look bad, and that's definitely something in his favor. The fact is he's not particularly the kind of media we'd want, right? In which case, stand up, be counted, change your newspaper, make sure you get access to better news. The internet gives you access to the world's news, right? But it's not just that rarefied. You can pick different newspapers, they exist. You've just not made the effort to find out. And then you blame the news media? Of course, journalism and the news industry are different, but you can't have one without the other. And therefore, we must recognize that this debate is about us and what we believe. This debate is about taking responsibility for your own actions. If you vote yes, you're essentially saying that you've done everything you could. All of you individually have done everything you could to get access to good media. Have you? Have you really? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vipul Nanda. With your arguments that seem to have brought the debate back straight into the zone of contention, you have now raised two important questions that the proposition will probably have to answer, and upon the answer of which this debate could very well turn. The first of these, as has been identified by opposition, why should the entirety of the media be said to have the liability if it is indeed certain sections of the media that are propagating the bad image of the media? Secondly, in their response to the idea that the demand from the consumers is indeed inelastic, the opposition seems to be basing their case on the idea that people have a right to choose. So by going on the offensive, they seem to be suggesting that if all of the media were indeed of one particular good journalism type, as you would want it, this would be impinging on the rights of people to enjoy better news. Is this indeed true? To answer this question, we probably have no better authority than Mr. Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, who will now take the stage.
Don't envy Veera Raghav. As a penultimate speaker, it's a very tough act to follow. Everybody who had to say whatever they had to have said it. All your clever one-liners have been stolen. Be that as it may, my young friend Vipul Nanda would like to delude himself into believing that, if you have your remote in your hand, if you psych yourself into believing every morning your bowels move smoother if you read the Hindu instead of the Times of India, all your problems would be solved. Well, of course, we are, all entitled to our delusions. I'm reminded, I come from the worst place in the whole of India. It's called Delhi. Oh, sorry, Delhi. Lily, don't be silly. You're hotter than a red chili ever since you started living in New Delhi. I come from a unique city in the world. It's the only city in the world where there are 16 English daily newspapers. Unique. No other city in the world has 16 English daily newspapers. But there's a catch. The top two newspapers, the Times of India and the Hindustan Times, Mr. Vinod Sharma's paper, together account for about 75% of the total circulation of all English daily newspapers. Add to that the third most widely circulated newspaper, the Economic Times, and you have about over 80%. So the question that you're asking is, why are 13 newspapers vying for a share of the market which is less than 20%? The answer lies in what Professor Hargopal and some of my other colleagues are saying. Some of the